Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of my Wrestlemania video series, MVP LVP, the most valuable players and the least valuable players in Wrestlemania history, where we go through each Wrestlemania event and I determine who was the MVP and who was the LVP. And in my complete random order of doing this, the next Wrestlemania for review is Wrestlemania 9, one that kind of has a dubious reputation, is generally remembered by fans as being one of, if not the absolute worst Wrestlemania. I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't think it's a great Wrestlemania by any means. I think the ending was terrible, but I don't think it's unquestionably the worst, like its reputation seems to suggest it is. But who was the MVP of the show? Who was the one that helped it to stand out and delivered the overall best moment of the show? I could go with Bret Hart or The Undertaker, who were both guys that were put into somewhat terrible situations, had to do the best they could to make it work. Bret Hart being the world champion, going in, dropping the belt to Yoko just so Yoko could turn around and drop the belt to Hogan. It was like Bret was being swept under the rug. Not the best situation to be put in, but he did the best he could to make that work. The Undertaker got stuck working with Giant Gonzalez, which is... I don't envy anybody put in that position, but he did the absolute best he could to make that match work. And I honestly, as I've said before, I don't think the match is nearly as bad as its reputation. I think they kind of booked themselves out of a disaster there. And it should be one of the worst matches in WrestleMania history, and overall, a lot of people say it is. I don't agree. I think it was just something... It was quick, to the point, highlight the strengths, hide the negatives, and let Undertaker do something cool. And that's pretty much what they did. So, I didn't think that match turned out nearly as poorly as it could have. Other guys I was thinking of, Lex Luger, who had a really cool entrance with the narcissist character being presented at the WrestleMania stage. And I look back at that entrance he had with the girls, with the mirrors and everything, and I thought, man, they really should have never dropped the narcissist gimmick, because it was really flippin' great. And I thought Luger performed it well. I also thought about giving MVP to the Steiner brothers, who were part of what I felt was the match of the night for this WrestleMania, the Steiners versus the Head Shrinkers. And overall, I thought it was a really good match. Scott had a really strong performance. Rick Steiner had like the coolest counter, one of the coolest counters I've ever seen, where he countered a Doomsday Device into a power slam off the guy's shoulders. A really cool counter. So the Steiners got to have a standout performance with nothing stupid getting in the way. But MVP, and this is going to be a weird one, but I was in kind of a goofy mood when I was thinking of WrestleMania 9. I'm going to give it to Bobby Heenan, who not only did an outstanding job at the commentator's booth, again, this year working with Randy Savage and Jim Ross. Jim Ross making his debut with the WWE, and Bobby having to be the guy that would... he had to be the heel announcer in that situation, but he was also kind of the normal voice on... He was the voice of familiarity on a product that was changing. He didn't get to work with Monsoon this year, but Savage had never called him WrestleMania before, and Jim Ross, this was his first night in the company. So it was like a completely different announce team right off the bat, and Bobby had to be like the voice of familiarity to give us something familiar to help ease WWE fans into listening to someone like Jim Ross, who's got a very different announcing style and very different from what, say, Gorilla would do, and probably something that a lot of WWE fans weren't used to at the time. JR would obviously go on to be recognized by WWE fans as the greatest man to ever call a match ever, and I typically agree. I think Jim Ross is terrific. I thought he was terrific even before going to WWE, but I think Bobby's role at the announce desk really helped kind of ease JR in, and for that, I give Bobby a lot of credit. Also, his entrance at the start of the show was hilarious, where famously all the announcers had to wear togas. It was a Roman theme. It was in Caesar's Palace, and Bobby Heenan, now famously in one of his great comedic bits, rode in to the ringside area on a camel backwards. One of the all-time great comedic visuals in all of pro wrestling. It's just a sign of just how funny and how entertaining Bobby Heenan was. So, most valuable player for WrestleMania 9 goes to an announcer, Bobby the Brain Heenan. Some will see that as a bad thing, but to me, honoring Bobby Heenan is never a bad thing. I think Bobby's great. So, who's the LVP for WrestleMania 9? I'm going to give that to Hulk Hogan, who had a high negative impact on the main event. Mainly, Yokozuna wins the title, Hogan comes out, basically steals the title from him, and you end the WrestleMania on this big shock where Bret Hart kind of gets swept under the rug. Now, I mean, the ending, I kind of get that it was a shock. It was kind of, in a weird way, it was kind of the first Money in the Bank cash-in, long before Money in the Bank was even a thing. But there was some value to doing the shock, but at the same time, it felt like such a transparent political play just to have Hogan steal the belt and close out WrestleMania as the champion when it wasn't even advertised. And I've said in the past, if this had resulted in Hogan versus Bret at, say, King of the Ring or SummerSlam, I would have been okay with it, but we didn't get that match, so what was the point? And Yoko would just win the belt back a few months later anyway, so the whole experience just felt completely pointless. So the biggest negative that people remember for this WrestleMania, aside from maybe the togas, was Hulk Hogan's fault, so I'm going to give him least valuable player, which feels wrong because Hogan is arguably the greatest icon in the history of WrestleMania, so for him to be the worst part of one is kind of sad to see, but 1993 was a weird year, what can I say? Next up on my completely random order of WrestleManias to review for this thing is WrestleMania 32. It's funny, the two newest WrestleManias they actually already come up in the series. Funny how the randomizer actually picked the numbers out, but WrestleMania 32, MVP, was a little hard here because this was not the best WrestleMania, so trying to find something really good to highlight was hard to do. AJ Styles had his WrestleMania debut, which was cool, but he had a match with Jericho where he didn't go over when he should have, and the match itself was good, not great, so it's kind of like, he didn't really have a standout performance. The New Day had a really great entrance, but then got roped into all the stupid bullshit that happened after the match that they had with the League of Nations, so not really. And then you have Charlotte, Sasha, and Becky, who I felt the women on that show easily had the match of the night. Granted, it was a weak show, but for the first time in WrestleMania history, I would say the women had the match of the night, so good for them. But I'm going to give MVP to Shane McMahon because he's a crazy son of a bitch, and he damn near killed himself just to create the greatest highlight from this WrestleMania, where he dove off the Hell in a Cell during his match with The Undertaker. A match that was not good, but you had that one spot that made people forget the match wasn't good, making it Undertaker's best WrestleMania match from 30 onward, kind of by default. And it was kind of sad and pathetic, but it is what it is. And hey, a great visual and a great moment is a great moment and a great visual, so I won't challenge that. So Shane McMahon, through sheer insanity, gets MVP for WrestleMania 32. Least valuable player. I thought about giving it to The Rock for his role on the show where he just came out and humiliated the Wyatt family and did unfunny shtick and was terrible. And, you know, I typically don't think of The Rock as terrible, but he was on this night. Thought about giving it to Triple H, who went as the champion and had yet another bomb in the main event, something that Triple H has done way too many times. He's done it more times to be acceptable for a multi-time WrestleMania main eventer. When you look at, I mean, with Sid, they stopped at 2, and I would even argue, like, the 2 main events of his that bombed weren't even really his fault for the most part. But Triple H just keeps getting put into these main event spots at WrestleMania, and he keeps bombing for the most part, not all the time. I mean, the triple threat at 20 was good, but he was working with Shawn Michaels and Chris Benoit, so I mean, if you can't deliver in that situation, go fuck yourself. But, yeah, the match with Roman was not good, but I'm going to give least valuable player to Triple H's opponent from WrestleMania 32, Roman Reigns, who was in the main event, just primed and ready to be coronated as the guy. And he's going to be the champion, and he's going to beat the game in the main event of WrestleMania, and it was so forced and so rammed down your throat and so just meticulously plotted step for step against the will of the people that nobody gave a shit. I mean, the sheer apathy from that crowd was, I mean, you could feel it. You could, you could almost smell it. I didn't think apathy could have a smell, but this case did, and it resulted in one of the worst main events in WrestleMania history, and if at all possible, it felt like Roman was even less over after this match than he had beforehand, and that's, how many times has that happened with a babyface being situated as the guy with the win in the main event of the WrestleMania. Does anybody call it the WrestleMania? No, I don't think so. Anyway, too many does. Anyway, what was supposed to be Roman Reigns' crowning achievement ended up being kind of a disaster and ended WrestleMania 32 on a very, 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 very sour note. But with that, let's move on to the third WrestleMania, third and final. WrestleMania 13, another one that is really, wow, 3 like lackluster manias this week, man. I guess it's good to get all the bad ones out of the way first, so that way it's all peaches and cream following this. But yeah, WrestleMania 13, unlucky number 13, was a huge disaster for the company in many ways. The main event bombed. The buy rate was terrible. WCW beat them in the buy rate that month with WCW Uncensored 97, a pay-per-view with a shitty Battle Royal main event that felt like a throwaway B pay-per-view, and it ended up doing a better buy rate than WrestleMania. That's crazy to think now, but it happened, and the show was just a disaster from start to finish. But I mean, obviously, who do you give MVP to? I mean, that's one of the easiest picks. You give it to Stone Cold Steve Austin, who, in spite of everything else on the show just being dead air, pointless, and a waste of time, Austin and Bret went out there and had an all-time classic, a match that some people say is the greatest match in the history of the business, and one that pretty much saved this WrestleMania from being unquestionably the worst. The fact that it speaks to how bad this WrestleMania is that it has a match as good as this on it, and it's still in people's like bottom 5 or bottom 3. It is such a terrible show, but that match was amazing and is a classic. And Bret had a stellar performance and really gave his all in this match as well. But Austin was made a star in this, and a lot of that is Bret's doing, but Austin had to pull his own weight too, and he more than delivered. And in a losing effort against the Hitman, Steve Austin like became a superstar almost instantly, and a huge star-making moment for him. And just, you know, after that, it was just sky's the limit for Stone Cold. And when he was main eventing WrestleMania the next year, I don't think anybody was surprised that he would be situated in that spot, because after that match, you couldn't deny him. He was just that over and that good. And the double turn that they did just put Austin on the right path to eventually getting to that spot. It's funny, when I get around to WrestleMania 14, I might talk about how Austin winning that night was the exact opposite of what happened with Roman Reigns, but at 32. But moving on from there, we do have to pick a least valuable player, which is extremely hard to do, because the show, like, nobody looked good on the show. Bret and Austin were the only ones in this whole show that came off looking good. Everybody else was either in a nothing match, or they were in a shitty match that made them look even worse than they were when the match started. The only other person that didn't come off like shit was, God rest her soul, Chyna, who was in Triple H's corner and looked imposing in his corner. She's literally the only other person that had any kind of benefit coming out of WrestleMania 13 outside of anyone involved in the submission match. But if I'm going to pick a least valuable player, I'm going to give it to Shawn Michaels. Which might seem unfair considering he didn't perform on this show, but he was an announcer during the main event. Guest announcer. This was right after he had lost his smile after he'd gotten injured. Depending on what you believe, I think the injury is rather dubious myself. The timing is very convenient too. And, you know, his pulling out of the main event because he didn't want to put Bret over, it resulted in the submission match, but it also resulted in a WrestleMania that was absolutely putrid. So, I mean, your main event was Sid versus The Undertaker, which had no heat, no program, no nothing. It was just something that they had to throw together because, fuck it, they didn't have anything else. And Shawn Michaels, who was going to be the champion at this year's WrestleMania, lost his smile, pulled out, and ruined everything. So, you know, that one move from Shawn Michaels... And, you know, I guess I'll say it. Do I believe that the injury was legit? Honestly, not really, because Shawn... That was what Shawn was like back then. He just kind of had... That was part of his MO. That was how he carried himself as a wrestler. You know, he didn't like doing jobs. He liked being on top. That was Shawn. And that's just... I mean, Mick Foley said it best in his first book all those years ago. Shawn was known for two things: being an amazing performer, one of the best around, and being kind of an asshole. And that's... And that's how you get situations like I lost my smile and what happened in WrestleMania 13. But the good thing that came out of it was the silver lining was the star-making moment for Stone Cold Steve Austin. So at least we got that out of WrestleMania 13 and Shawn Michaels' smile-losing ways. But that is all I have for this. Stay tuned for more. I'll have part 3 up later this week. But until then, enjoy your week, everybody.